The other thing the kidney does is electrolyte balance.
Keep going.
So we're going to go through this pretty quickly because it's just a matter of looking at concentrations and just kind of understanding why. So I kind of set it up in a way where it's exactly kind of what I want you to think about. So we have a term for a change in homeostasis, and what we're dealing with is sodium. So if you're low sodium, it's hyponatremia. If you have way too much sodium on board, it is hypernatremia. Clinically, what we would see is a normal range if you send blood to panel and they send it back. The normal range for sodium is about 135 to 142. So if you're under 130, you're low. If you're over 150, you're high. The reason why you get there is you have a decrease in intake, or you have diarrhea, you have vomiting, or you have an aldosterone deficiency. Remember, aldosterone helps you reabsorb sodium. So if your body's not producing aldosterone, you would be peeing sodium out in higher concentrations all the time. All right? That would put you in a state of hyponatremia. Or maybe you were having trouble peeing, so you went to the hospital, and they gave you a bunch of diuretics. Or maybe you just decided to drink a whole bunch of alcohol, which is diuretic. The inverse, what we put you in hypernatremia, is a state of dehydration. Excessive sodium intake because you're salting your potato chips. Or excessive sodium in intravenous fluids because somebody didn't read the bag correctly. And when you get IVs and you're on TV, it's started a solution of normal saline, right? Well, those bags can be low to high depending on what the state of the person is. So if somebody's just ran a marathon, they end up in an emergency room, and they're in the state of hyponatremia because they were sweating like crazy, then you can actually get them saline that's real high in sodium to help them recover. But if you put that saline in a normal person, then you're going to drive them into hypernatremia. So we just goofed up on our intravascular fluids. So what would we see in the patient? Over here, muscle weakness, dizziness, headache, hypotension, which would be low blood pressure, tachycardia, which is a high heart rate, and then they tend to go towards shock, they have mental confusion, and coma. So it's something we'd see in athletic events where it's warm during the athletic event, and they've been drinking regular water and not Gatorade or something else. So marathoners in particular become hyponatremic pretty quick, and then it's something you always have to look at, be careful with. Bike riders, distance bike riders, and something as well. So hypernatremia would typically be due to dehydration and stuff. And what those patients are going to be is intensely thirsty. Like they just want to drink and drink. Instead of being in hypotension, which would be low blood sugar, they're going to be in hypertension, which would be high blood sugar. They're going to have edema, so their hands and feet are going to begin to swell. And then they become agitated and have convulsions. And both lead to death if not taken care of quickly enough. There was actually a woman in Hawaii about 7 years ago, shows up in an aid station in a marathon. She had all these signs. The person in the aid station thought, oh my God, she's dehydrated, and gave her a bunch of water. But then that drove her into a worse state of hyponatremia, and she died from it. So if you've been out exercising and it's been really hot and you start feeling funny, like, man, my brain is just kind of, and you're like, I got this dull headache that's going on. And then if you have a way to take your blood pressure, like, oh, hey, my heart rate's just like crazy. And salt is the key. So my wife's a marathon runner. She ran a Portland Marathon in the late 2000s, one of the hottest Portland marathons the last 10 years. She finishes the race. I meet her. Her hands start doing this. Muscle weakness. Complained of a headache. Getting dizzy, having trouble standing up. my initial thought was, oh, she needs water. And she needed salt, yeah. So that was the one that taught me these really well. So now when she runs a marathon, feels a little dizzy, I just steal a bunch of salt tablets from McDonald's or someplace, stick out the tongue and pour it on her. Just give her salt that way. It's much cheaper than intravenous IVs in the emergency room later. Now it's amazing because the same thing happens to me when we ride a bike for distances. Like we'll ride from my house to Berlin back, so it's over 100 miles a day on a hot day. And when I get that feeling, if I take the salt pan and put it on my tongue, you do not taste salt. That is the bizarre thing. There is no salt. You taste the grainy texture of the salt. No salt taste. And so I usually put 3 or 4 on my tongue, drink a little bit, and then set a little bit, wait, and then pour another on my tongue, and then it's like, oh my God, that's salt. And then you know you've recovered your salt. It's amazing. It worked. It's worked with 4 people I've trained with. So, do you taste this? No. Here, have another one. Do you taste it? No. Have another one. Okay, let's wait a little bit and see what happens. It's amazing. Amazing. All right. So, if we're thinking about sodium, so remember, most of the sodium is picked up by the proximal convoluted tubule. We do some active transport of sodium in our loop of Henle, the ascending limb of Henle in particular. And then aldosterone helps us balance sodium intake over here, right? So we have, the loop of Henle is really designed to help us manage that. So this is just a kind of reiteration of everything we were just talking about. So if we have an increase in sodium, what are we in? Hypernatremia or hyponatremia? Hypernatremia. So if we're in hypernatremia, what could we do? We could take in more water, right? Because it dilutes that. Or if we can get rid of salt, we could do that. But in this instance, we're just, because we're going to, remember one of the things that was there was intense thirst. So what the patient would be doing is they have intense thirst, they drink a bunch of water, dilutes the sodium, and we're back to homeostasis. So chloride is an ion that hangs around with sodium. So it's always going to be higher in your interstitial spaces than inside your cells, right? So we would have a higher blood level of that. And again, when you look at normal ranges, if you drop below this, you're in the hypostate. And usually the upper state's a little more giving. So hyperchloremia here. The reason why you would get it would be excessive vomiting. Why vomiting? So what do you lose when you vomit? What's your stomach like? Hydrochloric acid. So chloride ions, you're losing chloride ions. And then overhydration would do it. And aldosterone deficiency would do it. And then people that are in congestive heart failure, you always have to worry about potassium, blood levels of potassium. And then if you're hyperchloremic, you're dehydrated, excessive intake, severe renal failure would do it. And then hyperaldosteronism. So this is not enough aldosterone, this is too much aldosterone. Then again, because sodium and potassium are responsible for depolarization and repolarizations, and where you're going to see is problems with muscles, cardiac problems, and nervous system problems. Because all those depend upon your ability to repeated depolarizations and repolarizations. So we'd have muscle spasms, hypotension again, so low blood pressure, muscle tetany, which would be cramping, occurring like crazy, and shallow respirations because the diaphragm has to undergo depolarization and repolarization of the function. And then in hyperchloremia, we would have somebody who's really tired, very lethargic in the brain. And then we have weak metabolic acidosis and hyperventilation. So shallow respiration, rapid deep respiration, opposite of that. was kind of interesting. And then, just thinking about it again, then the proximal convoluted tubule is responsible for managing chloride. We do transport in the Luca Henley again, and then our principal cells play a game with sodium and chloride in the distal convoluted tubule. So in normal physiology, our kidney is trying to maintain that balance. And what we see clinically is where the kidney just can't keep up with the reason why it's changing so quickly. So somebody's vomiting all the time, and they haven't taken electrolytes. Right, so potassium, where do we maintain most of our potassium? Inside cells or outside cells? Yeah. Inside cells. Yes. So look at your blood concentrations, normal blood concentrations of potassium. Normal blood concentrations of sodium. Look at that. Potassium's under 10, the other was well over 100. So that's because most of our potassium is normally inside our cells and not outside of our cells. So again, low potassium, hypochloremia, hyperchloremia, high potassium. Then excessive loss through vomiting again. So we lose potassium through vomiting and diarrhea. Get a decrease in intake of potassium, you just ate bananas and won't eat bananas. And then hyperaldosteronism, so that would be too much aldosterone. I'll show you why in a second. It's really very interesting. Now, excessive intake would be you love bananas, renal failure, or aldosterone deficiency. So what we're seeing in both sodium and potassium is aldosterone is a key player because it affects those principal cells and fine-tunes your urine. So what we're going to see is muscle fatigue. The muscles just don't want to contract at all, which we call flaccid paralysis. A lot of mental confusion. They'd be peeing like crazy. They'd be in a state of polyuria. Shallow respirations, and the heart would have arrhythmics to it. In hyperchloremia, the patient's usually really irritated. They feel nauseous all the time. They have vomiting and diarrhea and muscle weakness and ventricular fibrillation. So where the ventricles aren't wanting to contract completely. So you can see why all these lead to significant problems in patients if they go way beyond it. So the key is right here, and you're looking at what the principal cells do, is notice in this scenario they say if the principal cells are reabsorbing sodium and they're secreting potassium. Okay? So what happens is that you have to maintain electrolyte balance in your body. So if a principal cell, and here's the lumen, and the blood's over here. So if a principal cell is taking in one positive ion to put over here, it actually has to get rid of a positive ion, otherwise you're going to be electrically balanced. And so the game we always play is with sodium and potassium, because that's the one we have antiporters for all over our body. So what would happen is if we take in more sodium, we're going to give away more potassium. So if you have too much aldosterone, then you're going to drive yourself toward hypernatremia, but drive yourself toward hypokalemia. If you have a potassium deficiency, then you reverse that. And so, excuse me, if you have a aldosterone deficiency, you reverse that. So that's why if you look at those two graphs, you see aldosterone, too high of aldosterone, an aldosterone deficiency down here. And then if you go back to so if you go back to this one, they're just reversed. Aldosterone deficiency, and then it would be excessive. And that's why, because they're moving in the same opposite direction. So one more, and then we're going to look at pH balance, and then we'll be done. So calcium is critical, and where we have calcium in abundance in the blood, but nothing like we have in sodium. So when you're looking at these levels, if you just go back to this, look how much sodium we usually have here. Look how much potassium we usually have here. Well, calcium we have more in our blood, but nothing like we have sodium. Sodium is really the major positive ion for our blood. So this had a real high level, this had a real low level, and then this level is not much different than this, but it's actually carried more frequently in our blood. So we depend on it more for cardiac activity. So we look at calcium, then we have 4.5 to 5.3. If we drop below 4, we're in a hypo state. We go above 11, if it's almost twice enough, we're in a hyper state. So again, it's more giving on the hypercalcemic end of that. So without getting into a lot of detail, and we'll review it again when we do the endocrine system, remember the parathyroid, thyroid are the ones in your throat that control calcium metabolism. So we did that when we did bone. So if you have a hypoparathyroid, then you're going to have hypocalcemia. And if you have a hyperactive parathyroid, you're going to have hypercalcemia. So the good news is hyper goes with hypo, hypo goes with hypo. That would be the major reason clinically you would probably see it. But you could get it from a decrease in intake, or you drink copious amounts of soda pop with phosphorus and phosphoric acid. Or down here, you've taken excessive amounts of vitamin D. Vitamin D supplements are something that you need occasionally, maybe, but you don't want to take excessive amounts. And Paget's disease is a disease of remodeling of bone. So what you end up doing is taking too much calcium out of your bone all the time, and that elevates your blood levels because it impacts that. So what we would see is in hypocalcemia, you would have numbness, and that's because synaptic communication between neurons requires calcium. And if you can't communicate between one neuron and the other, then you can't send signals from your receptors in your extremities to your brain, and your brain has nothing to interpret. So it's like your foot went to sleep because you pinched a nerve when you were sitting there too long, and your fingers too weak, just like that, because you can't do that. Then you have hyperactive reflexes, so that was quite interesting. So if you were doing a patellar reflex, you wouldn't want to stand in front of this patient, because they're going to kick you. And then the muscle wants to cramp all the time. And then the real problem with this, if it gets severe, is the laryngeal muscles begin to spasm, and then you can't control the opening of your airway with your epiglottis, and it leads to your death, or asphyxiation. So in hyperkalemia, we're lethargic again, very tired, weakness, and people will not eat. They become anorexic. Really interesting thing to look at is what's going on with their blood in people that are anorexic. You look at calcium concentrations in the blood. And then it leads to kind of vomiting, a lot of urine production, polyuria, some bone pain, depression, confusion, coma. So they all lead to bad problems. So clinically, we always have to watch for these changes in electrolyte balance. And then again, what would normally happen is if you have too high a blood calcium level, the thyroid gland would release calcitonin and you deposit it in bone. If you have too low blood calcium levels, normally the parathyroid would release parathyroid hormone, and that would release the calcium from the bone. Okay? So the parathyroid is designed to release calcium from the bone. So if you're in hypoparathyroid, then you can't release calcium from the bone. So even though your blood calcium levels are dropping, what would normally release it from the bone to recover it isn't working. If you're in hyperparathyroidism, then you've got too much parathyroid hormone, and even though your blood calcium level is normal or high, because you got too much PTH, you keep releasing it from your bone all the time. And so that keeps driving it upward. So just remember when you're thinking about that, in normal physiology, if you entered a period of low blood calcium, you would want more PTH to release it from your bone. So if you have a hyperparathyroid, you're going to have way too much PTH, and you're going to constantly release it from your bone. And that drives your blood calcium level. It's something we see in elderly people. So the last thing we're going to look at is blood pH. Okay. So one of the first things you have to remember with blood pH is carbon dioxide in blood affects pH. So normally what we like to do is maintain a very narrow range of blood pH. If we're in homeostasis, 7.35 to 7.45. The biggest driver in normal physiology is a change in the carbon dioxide level in your blood. So what happens is that if you get an increase in carbon dioxide level in your blood, then it causes your blood to become more acidic. And as the blood becomes more acidic, we say you're in a state of acidosis. So if somebody's blood drops below 7.35, we say they're in a state of acidosis. Right? So if blood carbon dioxide levels drop, then blood pH is going to elevate, and we'll go above a state of 7.45. And when we're in a state of pH above 7.45, we say that the person is in alkalosis. So the basic thing is that if you get a more acidic blood, you enter a state of acidosis. If you have too basic a blood, you enter a state of alkalosis. And the real driver in most things, although we're going to talk about some other ways we make acid in our body, is the change in carbon dioxide levels. So if somebody is hyperventilating and we don't control their hyperventilations, then is their blood carbon dioxide level going to elevate or fall? It's going to fall. So the reason why we really put a paper bag over their mouth is we don't want them to enter a state of alkalosis. So inversely, if you have a patient who is in anaphylactic shock, for example, and their respiration has really dropped significantly, then their blood carbon dioxide levels are going to elevate. And that will eventually put that person in a state of acidosis. So when we have patients, one of the things we're really supposed to do is monitor their respiratory rates, because we can shift their blood pH, and it has consequences to their overall well-being. So the reason, again, is what we had drawn on the board over there, is if we add carbon dioxide to water, we get carbonic acid. If we get the formation of carbonic acid, we form hydrogen ions. And then these hydrogen ions would make us move toward acidosis. If we're withdrawing carbon dioxide from our blood, then we're reversing the equation. So this would be an elevation of carbon dioxide creates this. A decline in carbon dioxide creates the bottom one, and we would lose hydrogen ions. So as we lose hydrogen ions, the blood would become more basic, and we would enter a state of alkalosis. So the blue arrows would, what happen if that happens too much in your body, you would move toward acidosis. And over here, if the red ones are what's happening too much, then you would enter a state of alkalosis. So the blue indicates an increase in carbon dioxide, and the red indicates a decrease in carbon dioxide. And it relates to that last slide. And then what we try to prevent that from happening with is the fact that we form bicarbonate, and we have sodium in our blood, so we form sodium bicarbonate, which is a very important buffer to our body system. So So what's going on here is that I've got some acids that are entering my system from somewhere else. I've got some fixed acids or organic acids. Let's just say a person's been drinking copious amounts of soda pop with phosphoric acid. Right, so we've got this acid. What happens when you add anything to one of these reactions, then you can drive the reaction. So we talked about if you change carbon dioxide, you can reverse the reaction. That's what we just did. Well, you can also do that by changing the products. So if you add this, which is a product, then you're going to reverse the reaction. Does that make sense? So we could either change carbon dioxide or we could change hydrogen ions. And that's going to change the way the reaction works. So if we add carbon dioxide, we would drive the reaction this way. Or if we decrease the hydrogen ions over here, we would drive the reaction this way. If we decrease carbon dioxide over here or increase hydrogen ions over here, we're going to drive the reaction this way. So it's just a matter of chemical kinetics, looking at products and reactants. If you change the amount of products and reactants, you change the rate at which reactions are occurring. Right, so if a person is in acidosis, then their blood is too basic or too acidic. Too acidic. So what happens is, if the respiratory system is creating the problem, then we would say you're in respiratory acidosis. So somebody with asthma, somebody with emphysema, somebody who's got a respiratory issue, we always have to be concerned about what's going on in their blood with either acidosis or alkalosis. But anytime you get a decrease in respiratory activity, you're going to be concerned about acidosis. And anytime you got an overactive respiratory system, you're going to be concerned about alkalosis. Right? So the other way we get there is through metabolic activity. So where we're adding hydrogen ions from a different source. So one of the ways that could happen is you've been doing a lot of anaerobic respiration, which has caused your muscles to produce a bunch of lactic acid, for example, which would be an acid. So what we say then is the person is in respiratory acidosis if the issue is a respiratory issue. So if the person is got some hypoventilation event because they have emphysema, pulmonary edema, constructed airway, they're in anaphylactic shock, something has dropped their respiratory rates, then what's happening is they're going to enter acidosis, so we say it's respiratory acidosis. Well, the two organ systems that can help us are our lungs and our kidneys. So if your lungs are failing, your kidneys have to try to do the job. So what we would say is that a person in respiratory acidosis is going to have renal compensation. So the kidney is going to start trying to take care of the problem. So if we have too much acid in our blood, and we're going to convert those hydrogen ions to our urine, and we're doing a urine dipstick, then this person's urine is going to become more and more acidic as we're tracking it, right? Because the kidney is going to dump a bunch of hydrogen ions into the urine, trying to compensate. Does that make sense? So what we would increase then is we get an increased secretion of hydrogen ions in our urine, and we get an increased reabsorption of bicarbonate. So what cells help us with that in the distal convoluted tubular collector? Principally, the other one. Intercalated cells, yeah. So intercalated cells are the ones that are going to help us with that. And what's interesting is we'll get that drop in hydrogen ions that we want, but we'll also get an increase in bicarbonate ions. And normally our bicarbonate ions are between 24 and 28 in blood, so we would go way above 28. So we would know it in the patient, not only by looking at hydrogen ions, but by looking at bicarbonate. in their blood as well. So if it's for some other reason, and so the interesting one to think about, the easy one to think about, is that if the kidney was helping us here, what happens if you have a patient in kidney failure? Then the intercalated cells can no longer help us, right? So if the kidney can't help us, what organ system is going to help us? The respiratory system. The two systems work together. So when you're in metabolic acidosis, it's not because your respiratory system's not working. It could be because you have renal failure. It could be because you had a tremendous amount of diarrhea and you lost a bunch of bicarbonate. So remember, bile has bicarbonate in it. Pancreatic juice has bicarbonate in it. Normally we reabsorb all that so we can recycle it. But if you have diarrhea, fluids moving through too quickly, you can't reabsorb. So you end up with the loss of bicarbonate. So if the kidney can't help us, the respiratory system will. So we're in a state of acidosis, which is essentially saying we have too much carbon dioxide in our blood. So if we want to get more carbon dioxide out of our blood, are we going to hypoventilate or hyperventilate? Hyperventilate, yeah. And we don't want to put that bag over the mouth because we want them to get that carbon dioxide out. So what that would do then is it would decrease our partial pressure of carbon dioxide. But because a lot of our carbon dioxide is carried by bicarbonate, instead of having high bicarbonate levels in our blood up here like we have, we're going to now have low bicarbonate levels in our blood because our lungs are giving off all the carbon dioxide. Right? So one way you can, if you just had a blood test and you know the person's in acidosis, but you're like, why is this person in acidosis? If they have high bicarbonate, there's something going on with their respiratory system. If they have really low bicarbonate, then it's most likely not the respiratory system, and maybe the kidney. So again, normally the proximal convoluted tubule can secrete hydrogen ions and absorb bicarbonate. The loop of inlet can absorb bicarbonate. And then we fine-tune it over here with our intercalated cells and trying to adjust for those. So this is just the same thing we're just looking at, just done in a different thing. So what we're in is a state of acidosis. And if we're in a state of acidosis, we're essentially saying we have too much hydrogen in our blood, right? So our blood pH is too high. So our kidneys can compensate. So what would the kidneys want to do? Well, they want to get rid of this hydrogen ions, right? So they would secrete hydrogen ions, and the patient's urine would become more and more acidic, right? And if the kidney can co-generate carbon dioxide, the intercalated cells can co-regenerate the bicarbonate. How would that help us? Because if we had bicarbonate here, we're going to drive the reaction in this direction, which will get rid of our hydrogen ions because we recombine the hydrogen with bicarbonate to form carbonic acid, and it dissociates to form carbon dioxide and water over here. So we can do it two ways. We can secrete the hydrogen ions, or we can generate bicarbonate, and that'll help us. What would the lungs be doing? Well, we would hyperventilate. We would get rid of CO2. So if we're dropping this as a product, then we're going to drive this equation in this direction, right? And if we drive the equation in this direction, what's going to happen to this hydrogen atom? It's going to recombine with bicarbonate to form carbonic acid, which is dissociated to form water and carbon dioxide. So what we're doing is we're in a state of too much acid in our blood, and we're resolving that. And so in normal physiology, every day, if we have a slight shift in this, our kidneys help us, and our lungs help us, and keep us in homeostasis. If the lungs can't work, the kidneys have to do the job, right? If the kidneys aren't working, then the lungs have to do the job. but usually they try to work together to do the job. That's why I teach the urinary system and respiratory system together, because they work on this, right? This is just exactly what we said. So we're in a state of respiratory acidosis. That means our lungs aren't working, so who's going to do the job? Kidneys. So we'll end up with renal compensation. How will we do it? We'll secrete hydrogen ions in our urine, and we'll try to add bicarbonate to our blood, right? And by doing so, we can resolve the issue. So this is metabolic acidosis. So it's the same thing, just that now what's going on is we've got some metabolic acidosis going. It's dropped the blood pH, and in both systems normally we try to help, right? So if we're in a state of acidosis, we've got too much carbon dioxide in our blood. So what would we want to do with our respiratory rate? Increase it or decrease? If we have too much carbon dioxide in our blood, increase it. So the patient would start to hyperventilate, yeah. So what would our kidneys do? They would secrete hydrogen ions and make new bicarbonate ions. And how clinically would we know that was happening? If we tested the patient's urine, and their urine was becoming more and more acidic, yeah. And we know the kidney is compensating. So the other is alkalosis, right? So that means our blood is too basic. So again, we can have respiratory alkalosis or we can have metabolic alkalosis. In respiratory alkalosis, it's largely due to a dysfunction of the respiratory system, and that would be due to hyperventilation. So we could have hyperventilation because we're in a state of low oxygen, like trying to climb Everest, or because we have a pulmonary deficiency, like emphysema or something like that, pulmonary disease, anxiety, cardiovascular event, or aspirin overdoses drive people into hyperventilation. So if the lungs are creating the problem because they're hyperventilating, they can't help us. So who's going to help us? The kidney. So in this instance, we're too basic. So what do we want to do with hydrogen ions? Do we want to put them in our urine, or do we want to reabsorb them? We want to reabsorb them, right? So then this patient's urine would become more and more basic, yeah. So what we want to do is we want to decrease our excretion of hydrogen ions in our urine, and we want to decrease our reabsorption of bicarbonate. So in this patient, what we would see, because we were hyperventilating, is we would be in a state of hypocapnia because we'd have too low of carbon dioxide in our blood, and we'd also be we'd also have a low amount of bicarbonate because the kidney is not reabsorbing bicarbonate. So we would have a low of both of those. So for metabolic alkalosis, one of the common reasons you get there is through vomiting. And because what's the stomach producing again? Hydrochloric acid. And this time we're not worried about the chloride like we were last time. We're actually worried about the hydrogen ions. So if we've got this really bad vomiting, and really in some diseases where you can't control vomiting, little children can die in 3 or 4 days because they go into this state of metabolic alkalosis. And geriatric patients, very old people, because they're the ones whose body has trouble maintaining homeostasis. And so their control mechanisms aren't as strong. And the other reason was maybe you have a patient who tried to overdose, so to try to save their lives, you suck all this stuff out of the stomach. And then you just did a mechanical vomit instead of a normal vomit. And so you lost all these hydrogen ions. And then what if the kidney was failing? And if the kidney was failing, who would try to do the work? The respiratory system. So if the kidney was failing, we would have respiratory compensation. And what's going on here is we're too basic, right? So do we want to add hydrogen ions to the blood or decrease hydrogen ions? We want to add them. So if we want to add hydrogen ions to the blood, do we want to increase carbon dioxide in the blood or decrease carbon dioxide? We want to increase carbon dioxide in the blood, right? Because if you increase carbon dioxide in the blood, then you form the carbonation of carbonic acid, which is going to dissociate and form hydrogen ions, right? So then how would we increase the amount of carbon dioxide in our blood? Hyperventilate or hypoventilate? Hypoventilate. So this patient would be going, very, very low. And then, because we're hypoventilating and we're driving the carbon dioxide level up in our blood, not only do we form hydrogen ions, but we form bicarbonate ions. So, in respiratory acidosis, we would have low levels of blood bicarbonate, but in metabolic acidosis, we would have high blood levels of bicarbonate if we tested for bicarbonate in the blood. So if you want to become an ICU nurse, that's what they're doing all the time. People in the intensive care is checking their blood levels for pH values. Because they're in trouble and they're having trouble doing it. So the same game again is the proximal convoluted tubule and secrete hydrogen ions reabsorbed bicarbonate. The lipid reabsorbs bicarbonate. And then our intercalated cells are our fine check on that within our cardiovascular system. And then again, what we're doing in our lungs is we're giving off carbon dioxide typically. And as we're giving off carbon dioxide, we are making the blood more basic. Because we're losing carbon dioxide, so we drive the equation in the opposite direction. So this just reiterates everything we just said. So in this instance, we're losing hydrogen ions for some reason. So as we're losing hydrogen ions, the blood is becoming more basic, and so the patient's in a state of acidosis, alkalosis. So if we're in a state of alkalosis, then the kidney would try to help us, and the lungs would try to help us. So the lungs, if we're in a state of alkalosis, it means we don't have enough carbon dioxide in our blood. So the lungs would enter a state of hyperventilation or hypoventilation. And it would be hypoventilation, because we want to increase the amount of carbon dioxide so we can make more carbonic acid so we can free up these hydrogen ions. So we would hyperventilate. And that's what would bring it back. And in the kidney, would it want to secrete hydrogen ions? No, it would want to stop secreting hydrogen ions. And if it can generate hydrogen ions, that would even be better yet. So the intercalated cells would stop secreting hydrogen ions to the urine. So the patient's urine would become more and more basic, right? When we would test it. And then the patient would begin to secrete bicarbonate. The reason is, in their urine, which would make it more basic. The reason is, again, is because if I can take this bicarbonate here and remove it, then I'm going to drive this equation in that direction. So if I remove a product, I have to make more product, and I'll get more hydrogen, which is what I want to do. Okay? This is just another way of looking at it. So we were in homeostasis, but all of a sudden we get a loss of hydrogen ions because we are vomiting. And we're losing these hydrogen ions like crazy. And then we have a gain of bicarbonate. So we have We have an increase in bicarbonate, so we have an increase in pH, so the patient is in a state of alkalosis or acidosis. So increase in blood pH, alkalosis. So normally the respiratory system would help us, the kidney would help us. The respiratory system, because we're in a state of alkalosis, would want to generate hydrogen ions. The way we generate hydrogen ions is to hypoventilate. Right? If we hyperventilate, we actually lose hydrogen ions. So we would have a decreased respiratory rate. And then the kidney itself would try to generate hydrogen ions again and try to secrete bicarbonate ions. Because we're too basic, so we want to get rid of a buffer that's helped making us stay basic, and we want to find some new hydrogen ions to make us more acidic, bring us back to normal. So, if we're in a state of respiratory alkalosis, then our lungs can't help us, so who's going to help us?
Kidneys.
Our kidneys. So if we're in a state of respiratory alkalosis, we're going to have renal compensation. And then what the kidney is going to do is try to increase hydrogen ions in the blood, decrease bicarbonate ions in the blood. And then eventually, if our respiratory system can help us, we would begin to hyperventilate. Right? The patient would be hyperventilating.